January 17, 1944, Western Pacific Ocean. The water was black glass beneath a sky still clinging to night. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage stood in the conning tower of USS Parche, his hands gripping cold steel, eyes fixed on the horizon where darkness met darker darkness. The submarine rocked gently in the pre-dawn swell, a predator waiting. Around him, the air tasted of salt and diesel fuel, thick and metallic on the tongue. Through the hatch below, he could hear the muted clinking of coffee mugs, the whispered calculations of the fire control party, the hum of electric motors that kept them suspended between surface and abyss. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of sight, a Japanese convoy was cutting through these waters. Merchant ships fat with supplies for garrisons that were slowly starving. Escort destroyers circling like anxious sheepdogs. Ramage raised his hand. The periscope hissed upward, breaking the surface for exactly 3 seconds. In that brief window he saw them. 7 cargo vessels, 3 escorts, steaming in formation at 12 knots. Then the scope dropped, and Parche descended back into invisibility. But something was different this time. Something the Japanese lookouts had not yet learned to recognize. The periscope had barely kissed the surface, a feather's touch, and already Parche was gone, leaving nothing but a ripple that dissolved into the general chaos of wind and wave. The Japanese destroyer Shikinami, 2,000 yards to starboard, continued its patrol pattern, unseeing, unknowing. Its crew scanned the horizon with binoculars, watching for the telltale feather of white water that marked a submarine's periscope wake. They were watching for ghosts of yesterday's war. They did not know that the Americans had changed the rules. This was not the submarine warfare of textbooks and naval academies. This was something new, born from desperation and ingenuity in equal measure. In January 1944, the United States submarine force in the Pacific was engaged in what historians would later call the most successful interdiction campaign in naval history. A campaign that would strangle Japan's ability to wage war more effectively than any bomber raid or surface battle. But success had come at a terrible price. In the first 2 years of the Pacific War, American submarines had been forced to attack with periscopes raised high, exposed, visible from miles away in good conditions. Japanese escort commanders had grown skilled at reading the ocean's surface, spotting the distinctive wake pattern, the feather of disturbed water that trailed behind even the most carefully raised periscope. Standard doctrine required a periscope to extend approximately 6 feet above the waterline for effective observation, 6 feet of steel tube catching sunlight, creating a wake, broadcasting the submarine's position to any alert lookout, and the Japanese were alert. Their escort training emphasized visual vigilance above all else. Every merchantman lost to torpedo attack represented tons of rice that would not reach Rabaul, aviation fuel that would not fill zeros at Truk, ammunition that would not supply the garrisons at Tarawa or Kwajalein. The Imperial Japanese Navy had responded with increasingly aggressive anti-submarine tactics, longer patrol patterns, more frequent depth charge attacks, coordination with patrol aircraft. By late 1943, the odds were shifting. American submarine commanders were discovering that the old methods, the high periscope, the extended observation, the careful stalking approach, were getting men killed. But in the workshops and laboratories of Pearl Harbor, in the crowded submarine tenders moored at Brisbane and Fremantle, a solution was emerging. It was not a dramatic invention, not a secret weapon delivered from some research facility in a dramatic flash of genius. It was simpler than that, and perhaps more profound. American engineers and submariners were learning to look at old problems with new eyes, to question assumptions that had governed submarine warfare since the days of the Great War. The periscope, That elegant optical device that had defined submarine combat for 3 decades was being reimagined. What if, instead of raising the scope high enough to see clearly in all directions, you raised it barely above the surface? What if you sacrificed perfect visibility for near-perfect invisibility? What if you taught submarine commanders to hunt not with clear vision, but with glimpses, fragments, the discipline to piece together a targeting solution from stolen glances at the surface? The concept was radical because it violated established doctrine. Naval warfare demanded observation, situational awareness, the comprehensive view. But American submarine commanders were discovering that in the Pacific's vast expanses, where Japanese convoys had grown cautious and escorts had grown deadly, the most valuable asset was not seeing everything. It was not being seen at all. The Japanese expected American submarines to behave according to pattern. They expected the high periscope, the extended observation period, the predictable approach from the convoy's flanks or stern. Japanese escort doctrine, refined through 2 years of bitter experience, was built on detecting these patterns. Lookouts were trained to scan the horizon in systematic sweeps, watching for the bright flash of sunlight on wet steel, the distinctive V-shaped wake that marked a periscope moving through calm water. Hydrophone operators listened for the characteristic sound signature of a submarine at periscope depth. The subtle change in machinery noise, the slight increase in speed as the boat maneuvered for attack position. Anti-submarine warfare in 1944 was a chess game, and the Japanese believed they understood how the pieces moved. They posted lookouts on elevated platforms, equipped them with high-quality binoculars, rotated them frequently to maintain alertness. They organized their convoys in defensive formations designed to maximize overlapping fields of observation. They coordinated with patrol aircraft to provide aerial reconnaissance. They had studied American attack patterns from action reports and interrogated survivors. They believed they had adapted. What they had not anticipated was that the Americans would refuse to play the game by the established rules. In February 1943, the submarine USS Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor after a patrol that became legend in the silent service. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, had achieved something remarkable. 7 confirmed ship sinkings in a single patrol, an unprecedented success rate. But what fascinated the submarine community was not just the number of kills, it was Morton's methodology. He had begun experimenting with what submariners called the low periscope approach, raising the scope barely above the waterline, accepting degraded visual conditions in exchange for reduced detectability. Morton's reports described attacks conducted with the periscope raised less than 3 feet, sometimes less than 2 feet above the surface. At that height, visual observation was compromised by wave action, spray, and the extreme narrowness of the visible horizon. But the periscope wake was nearly non-existent. The feather that Japanese lookouts trained to spot simply did not form. The periscope cut through the water like a fin, leaving only the most subtle disturbance, one that disappeared into the general texture of wind-driven waves within seconds. Other submarine commanders studied Morton's reports with the intensity of theologians examining scripture. Could this technique be systematized? Could it be taught? What were the trade-offs? The technical challenges were substantial. Standard periscopes in 1944 were designed for observation at comfortable heights, 6 to 8 feet above water, provided clear sight lines, stable imagery, and enough elevation to see over wave crests in moderately rough seas. Dropping to 2 or 3 feet meant working with an optical device at the very edge of its functional parameters. Wave action could obscure the view entirely for seconds at a time. Salt spray coated the lens. The visible horizon contracted dramatically. At 2 feet elevation, The geometric horizon was less than 2 miles away, compared to 3.5 miles at 8 feet. Tracking a distant convoy became an exercise in patience and calculation, piecing together fragmentary observations into a coherent picture of target position, course, and speed. Fire control solutions, the mathematical calculations that determined torpedo firing angles and timing, required more time to develop because observation periods had to be kept shorter to minimize detection risk. But American submarine commanders possessed advantages that made the technique viable. They had excellent fire control computers, analog mechanical devices called torpedo data computers that could maintain firing solutions based on intermittent observations. They had radar, increasingly sophisticated and miniaturized, that could provide ranging data without visual observation. Most importantly, they had something the Japanese did not: an institutional culture that encouraged tactical innovation and rewarded deviation from doctrine when it produced results. The transformation was not instantaneous. It spread through the submarine force like a whispered secret, commander to commander, boat to boat. USS Tang under Richard O'Kane, USS Silversides under John Coy, USS Flasher under Reuben Whitaker. These boats and their commanders became laboratories for the new technique. They experimented with periscope heights, exposure times, approach angles. They developed a new vocabulary. The feather became a thing to avoid rather than accept. Low and slow described the ideal periscope technique. Snap look meant raising the scope for 2 seconds or less before dropping it back below the wave tops. Action reports from late 1943 and early 1944 show the evolution of methodology. Commanders noted the absence of Japanese reaction even during daylight approaches in calm seas. They described successful attacks conducted with total periscope exposure times of less than 60 seconds. A dozen quick looks, each lasting 5 seconds or less, providing just enough information to update the firing solution. The Japanese escorts continued their patterns, their lookouts scanning empty horizons, their sonars listening for submarines that were closer than they could imagine. By January 1944, the technique had been refined to near perfection. Submarine commanders like Lawson Ramage on Parche had internalized the discipline it required. The process began long before the periscope broke the surface. First came the sonar picture. Hydrophone operators tracking the target convoy by sound alone, identifying individual ships by their distinctive propeller signatures, counting blade rates to determine speed, measuring bearing changes to estimate course. The torpedo data computer continuously updated the firing solution based on these acoustic observations, creating a mental picture of the enemy formation's geometry. Only when the solution was nearly complete, when the submarine was positioned ahead of the convoy's projected track, when the firing bearing was calculated, only then would the commander raise the periscope. And when he did, it rose slowly, just barely breaking the surface, the optical head emerging into daylight like a cautious eye opening. The commander had perhaps 3 seconds of observation before excessive exposure time created unacceptable detection risk. In those 3 seconds, he had to verify target identity, confirm the firing solution, check for unexpected escorts, and make the final decision to fire or maneuver. Then, down scope, down fast, the submarine dropping deeper as torpedoes left their tubes. The Japanese never understood what had changed. Their action reports from early 1944 show increasing frustration and confusion. Convoys were being attacked without warning, without any of the preliminary signs that had previously signaled submarine presence. Lookouts reported no periscope sightings. Radar operators detected no surface contacts. Sonar operators heard nothing unusual until the moment torpedoes entered the water, and by then it was too late for effective countermeasures. The escorts would race to the attack point, dropping depth charges and patterns around where they calculated the submarine must be. But Parche and her sisters were already gone, sliding away at depth, silent, invisible. The Japanese concluded that American submarines had developed some form of cloaking technology, some new material or technique that made their periscopes invisible. Intelligence reports from captured documents show Japanese naval analysts speculating about optical coatings, retractable periscopes, even submarines capable of remaining fully submerged during attacks. They could not accept the simpler truth. The Americans had simply learned to look with less, to operate at the very edge of visual capability, to trade comprehensive observation for tactical invisibility. There was poetry in the deception. The periscope itself became a symbol of the American approach to the Pacific War. Pragmatic, adaptive, willing to abandon established doctrine when reality demanded it. While Japanese naval strategy remained bound by concepts of decisive battle and surface supremacy, American submariners were fighting a different kind of war entirely, one that emphasized economic strangulation over glorious combat. Each merchant ship sent to the bottom represented not just tonnage, but sustenance denied to Japanese garrisons, raw materials that would never reach factories, finished goods that would never supply combat units. The submarine campaign was unglamorous, conducted in isolation by small crews in steel tubes, far from any newspaper correspondent or newsreel camera. But it was devastatingly effective. By mid-1944, Japanese merchant marine losses were exceeding replacement construction by a ratio of 5-to-1. The empire was bleeding to death, slowly, invisibly, strangled by submarines that had learned to hide in plain sight. The human dimension of this transformation was profound. American submarine commanders in 1944 were different from their counterparts in 1942. They were younger, more aggressive, less bound by pre-war doctrine. Many had served as junior officers during the early disasters, the period when American torpedoes often failed to detonate, when submarine doctrine emphasized caution over aggression, when the submarine force struggled to define its role in the Pacific campaign. They had learned from those failures. They had watched cautious commanders replaced by aggressive ones, seen successful innovators promoted and rewarded, understood that the service valued results over procedural compliance. This created an institutional culture that encouraged exactly the kind of tactical innovation represented by the low periscope technique. When a commander like Mush Morton returned from patrol with unorthodox methods and spectacular results, the response was not censure for doctrinal deviation, but requests for him to share his techniques with other commanders. The submarine force had become a learning organization, one that systematically captured lessons from each patrol, disseminated successful techniques, and ruthlessly culled unsuccessful approaches. It was a meritocracy in the truest sense. What mattered was not adherence to established procedure but effectiveness in combat. The Japanese never developed an equivalent institutional flexibility. Their naval culture emphasized tradition, hierarchy, and respect for established doctrine. Innovation came slowly, filtered through multiple command layers, often arriving too late to influence outcomes. When Japanese escort commanders reported difficulty detecting American submarines, the response was to increase the number of escorts, extend patrol patterns, demand greater vigilance from lookouts, all reasonable measures, but none that addressed the fundamental problem. They were trying to see what had been made invisible. Their lookouts scanned the horizons with superb binoculars and keen eyes, watching for periscope feathers that no longer existed. Their hydrophone operators listened for submarines that approached in near silence. Their radar operators swept the surface for contacts that remained submerged until the final moment. The Japanese were fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's methods, while the Americans had moved on to something new. By spring 1944, the low periscope technique had become standard doctrine in the American submarine force. Training materials at submarine school included detailed sections on the methodology. New commanding officers practiced the technique during workup periods before their first war patrols. The periscope manufacturers, companies like Kollmorgen and Bausch and Lomb, began designing optical systems optimized for low-height observation, with improved coatings to shed water more quickly and enhanced optics for extracting maximum information from brief, compromised observations. The technique that had begun as one commander's tactical innovation had been institutionalized, systematized, turned into doctrine itself, but it remained flexible doctrine, continually refined based on combat experience. Submarine commanders continued to experiment, finding new variations and improvements. Some found that in very calm seas they could operate with the periscope raised less than 18 inches, essentially invisible beyond a few hundred yards. Others developed techniques for rapid periscope work in rough weather, using wave action to mask even brief exposures. The learning process never stopped. The strategic implications were immense. Japan's ability to wage war depended absolutely on maritime logistics. The home islands possessed virtually no oil, limited food production capacity, and insufficient raw materials for sustained industrial production. Everything — oil from the Dutch East Indies, rice from Indochina, bauxite from Malaya, iron ore from China — had to be transported by sea. The merchant marine was Japan's jugular vein, and American submarines had found the perfect weapon to sever it. In 1944, American submarines sank more than 600 Japanese merchant vessels totaling over 2.7 million tons. These were not just numbers in a ledger, they represented a civilization slowly choking. Japanese civilians saw their food rations reduced, then reduced again. Factories operated at partial capacity, then shut down entirely for lack of raw materials. Military units in outlying garrisons, Rabaul, Truk, the Marshall Islands, were cut off from resupply, left to starve or surrender. The aerial bombardment of Japan's cities, the massive amphibious assaults across the Pacific, these were the visible face of American victory. But beneath the surface, the submarine campaign was doing something equally important. It was making it impossible for Japan to sustain the war economically. And the low periscope technique was central to that success, allowing submarines to operate with near impunity in waters where detection had once meant probable death. There is a particular action from June 1944 that illustrates the technique's effectiveness with crystalline clarity. USS Harder, under the command of Samuel Dealey, encountered a Japanese convoy off Tawi-Tawi in the Philippines. The convoy consisted of 4 tankers carrying fuel oil for the combined fleet, escorted by 3 destroyers. Dealey approached submerged in broad daylight, using the low periscope technique exclusively. His total periscope exposure time during a 40-minute approach was less than 90 seconds. 18 separate observations, each lasting 5 seconds or less. The Japanese destroyers maintained their patrol patterns. Their lookouts saw nothing. Their sonar detected nothing. Harder achieved firing position undetected, launched a spread of 6 torpedoes, and sank 2 of the tankers before diving deep to evade the inevitable counterattack. But here is the remarkable detail. The Japanese escorts never located Harder. They dropped depth charges in what they believed was the correct location. But Dealey had already moved, slipping away at depth while the escorts attacked empty water. Harder surfaced after dark 12 miles from the attack point, completely unscathed. The pattern repeated throughout that patrol. 5 destroyers sunk in addition to the tankers, each attack conducted with minimal periscope exposure, each followed by a clean escape. Daly's patrol report, preserved in the National Archives, describes the technique with clinical precision. Periscope exposure limited to 5 seconds maximum, raised scope to verify target bearing, and range only after fire control solution developed from sound bearings. Found that wave action at scope height less than 3 feet provided excellent concealment even in calm seas. The Japanese were not incompetent. Their escort commanders were experienced. Their lookouts were well trained. Their equipment was adequate. But they were trapped in an assumption that the Americans exploited ruthlessly, the assumption that submarine periscopes had to be visible to be effective. This assumption was not unreasonable. It had been validated by 3 decades of submarine warfare, by combat experience from the Atlantic and Mediterranean, by every naval engagement since World War I. Periscopes were supposed to create visible wakes. Submarines were supposed to be detectable during approach. These were facts, proven by experience. Except they were no longer facts because the Americans had changed the parameters. They had accepted degraded observation capability as the price of invisibility. They had trained their commanders to piece together firing solutions from fragmentary data. They had developed fire control systems that could maintain solutions through extended periods of blind navigation. They had created a new form of submarine warfare, and the Japanese never adapted because they never fully understood what had changed. Consider what this meant for a young Japanese lookout stationed on the bridge wing of an escort destroyer in mid-1944. He had been trained exhaustively in submarine detection. He knew to watch for the white feather of a periscope wake, the subtle straight line cutting across wave patterns, the flash of sunlight on wet metal. He scanned his sector with binoculars every few minutes, overlapping his coverage with adjacent lookouts to ensure no blind spots. He was vigilant, competent, doing everything his training demanded. And yet the submarines were there, unseen, undetected, positioning themselves for attacks that would send the ships he was protecting to the bottom. The psychological effect must have been devastating. The growing realization that vigilance was insufficient, that the enemy had found a way to bypass the entire detection system. Some Japanese action reports from late 1944 show a quality that might be described as resignation or fatalism. Convoys sailed knowing they would probably be attacked. Escorts maintained patrols knowing they would probably fail to detect the attackers until too late. The Americans had achieved something more profound than tactical advantage. They had achieved psychological dominance. The periscope itself, that simple optical device, had become a symbol of broader differences between the two naval forces. Japanese submarine doctrine remained focused on attacks against warships, the doctrine of decisive battle, seeking to reduce American naval strength through submarine attacks on carriers and battleships. American submarine doctrine had evolved toward economic warfare, targeting the merchant marine, understanding that Japan could be defeated by starvation and resource denial rather than glorious surface combat. Japanese submarines operated individually, conducting long patrols in distant waters, hunting for that perfect shot at an American carrier. American submarines operated as part of a coordinated campaign, with submarine command controlling patrol areas, directing boats toward known convoy routes, systematically strangling Japanese maritime logistics. The low periscope technique was emblematic of this American approach, pragmatic, focused on effectiveness rather than aesthetics, willing to sacrifice visibility and certainty for results. It was not a heroic technique. There was nothing glorious about raising a periscope 2 feet above the water for 5 seconds at a time. But it worked, and in the end, that was all that mattered. By late 1944, the Japanese merchant marine had been effectively destroyed. Of the approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping available to Japan in December 1941, less than 2 million tons remained operational by November 1944. Replacement construction had failed to keep pace with losses. The oil tanker fleet, the most critical component of maritime logistics, had been particularly hard hit. Without tankers, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies might as well have been on the moon. The fuel existed, but it could not reach Japan, could not power the factories or fuel the aircraft or drive the warships. The combined fleet, that magnificent instrument of naval power that had struck Pearl Harbor and ravaged the Pacific, was reduced to sitting in harbor conserving fuel. Aircraft carriers had no aviation gasoline for their planes. The economy contracted month by month. Food shortages became critical. By early 1945, Japanese civilians were surviving on rations that provided less than 1,500 calories per day, starvation level. This was the strategic effect of the submarine campaign, and techniques like the low periscope approach were its tactical foundation. There is an irony worth noting. The Japanese had pioneered optical technologies, had produced excellent binoculars and cameras and gun sights. Their lookouts were equipped with some of the finest optical instruments in the world. But American submariners defeated those instruments not with better technology, but with better technique, by denying the Japanese lookouts the visible signature they were trained to detect. It was asymmetric warfare in its purest form, identifying the enemy's strength and then refusing to engage it directly, instead attacking from an unexpected angle. The Japanese expected to detect periscopes visually, so the Americans made their periscopes invisible. The Japanese organized their convoys for overlapping observation, so the Americans attacked from positions where lookouts saw nothing until torpedoes were already in the water. The Japanese trained their escorts to respond to detected threats, so the Americans never allowed themselves to be detected. Each Japanese strength became irrelevant because it was never engaged. The human cost on both sides was substantial, though asymmetric. American submarine forces suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the U.S. military. Approximately 22% of submariners who deployed on war patrols were killed in action. 52 American submarines were lost during the Pacific War, taking more than 3,500 men down with them. But Japanese losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of merchant mariners died, trapped in sinking ships or drowning in oil-slicked waters. Tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors perished in ships sent to the bottom while transporting them to garrison posts. The civilian population suffered mass malnutrition and starvation as food imports ceased. The numbers are difficult to establish with precision, but estimates suggest that over 500,000 Japanese died as a direct or indirect result of the submarine blockade. Deaths from starvation, from ships sunk, from the economic collapse that left medical supplies unavailable and diseases untreated. These deaths were not dramatic. No newsreels captured them. No photographs documented them. They occurred in anonymity and silence, in the dark waters of the Pacific, in the hunger-hollowed faces of civilians queuing for rations that never arrived. The submarine campaign was total war in its most absolute form, a war not just against military forces but against an entire economy, an entire civilization's ability to sustain itself. The periscope, raised barely above the waves, became the instrument of this economic annihilation. Each brief glimpse of horizon and target, each 5-second observation that allowed a firing solution to be completed, each successful attack that sent another merchant ship to the bottom, these were the tactical components of strategic devastation. The Japanese never solved the problem because they never fully understood its nature. They continued to search for periscopes at 6 feet elevation, while American submarines operated at 2 feet. They watched for feathers that no longer formed. They listened for submarines that had learned to approach in near silence. Their entire anti-submarine doctrine, built on reasonable assumptions and validated by years of experience, had been rendered obsolete by a simple change in technique, and they could not adapt quickly enough to matter. April 1945. Tokyo Bay, evening. The war would end in 3 months. Japan's merchant marine had been reduced to coastal vessels, small craft that hugged the shoreline, trying to transport minimal cargoes between ports that could no longer be reached by larger ships. The submarines had moved on to different targets: mining operations, rescue missions for downed pilots, intelligence gathering. The economic war was over. The Americans had won it completely. In naval archives in Tokyo, staff officers compiled reports on the anti-submarine campaign, trying to understand what had failed. They noted the increasing difficulty of periscope detection in 1944 and 1945. They documented the puzzling absence of visual contacts despite confirmed submarine attacks. Some reports speculated about new American technologies: invisible periscopes, radar immune coatings, submarine cloaking devices. The truth, that American submarines had simply learned to operate with periscopes barely above the surface, appeared in a few reports, but it seems never to have been fully accepted or integrated into doctrine. It was too simple an explanation for such devastating results. There had to be more, some secret, some technological breakthrough that explained American dominance. The notion that better technique could overcome technological parity was somehow harder to accept than fantasies of invisible submarines. The periscope technique itself would become obsolete within a generation. Nuclear submarines operating at high speeds with sophisticated sonar systems would have no use for the patient. Careful periscope work that characterized World War II submarine combat. The torpedo data computer would be replaced by digital systems, then by weapons that guided themselves to targets. The entire paradigm of submarine warfare would shift towards speed and stealth rather than patience and invisibility. But in its moment, the low periscope technique represented something fundamental about how wars are won. Not necessarily through superior technology or resources, though those help, but through better adaptation to circumstances, through willingness to question assumptions, through institutional cultures that reward innovation and systematically learn from experience. The Americans developed the technique because their circumstances demanded it, and their culture permitted it. The Japanese failed to counter it because their circumstances did not force the same innovation, and their culture did not encourage the same flexibility. There is a particular poetry in the image of that periscope, barely breaking the surface, raised just high enough to see but low enough to remain unseen. It represents asymmetric warfare in physical form. The weak point in enemy defenses is not where they are strongest, but where they assume you cannot reach. The Japanese were watching the wrong part of the ocean, scanning for threats at the wrong altitude, locked into patterns that American submariners had abandoned. And so the convoys continued to sail, the escorts continued to patrol, the lookouts continued to scan the horizon, all of it futile, all of it bypassed by an enemy that had learned to operate in the space between waves, in the 3 feet of altitude that made all the difference between visibility and invisibility, between detection and devastation. The submarine war in the Pacific was many things: a technological competition, a campaign of economic strangulation, a test of courage and endurance for the men who fought it. But perhaps most fundamentally, it was a demonstration that success belongs not to those who perfect the established methods, but to those who recognize when established methods have become obsolete and possessed the institutional flexibility to develop new ones. The periscope, raised barely above the waves, was not elegant. It did not look impressive in reconnaissance photographs or feature in propaganda films, but it worked. It allowed submarines to approach undetected, attack successfully, and escape cleanly. It turned the submarine force into the most cost-effective weapon system of the Pacific War, less than 2% of American military personnel, accounting for more than 50% of Japanese maritime losses. Those numbers tell the story more eloquently than any narrative. A small force, using unconventional techniques, achieving strategic effects far beyond what their size suggested was possible. In the end, the low periscope technique succeeded not because it was technologically superior, but because it was conceptually superior, a recognition that invisibility was more valuable than comprehensive observation, that patience and discipline could overcome technological parity, that the enemy's strengths could be neutralized simply by refusing to engage them on expected terms. The Japanese lookouts never stopped scanning the horizon. They remained vigilant to the end, but they were watching for yesterday's submarines, yesterday's periscopes, yesterday's war. And while they watched the wrong part of the ocean, American submarines were below them, beside them, among them, unseen, undetected, unstoppable. The periscope rose just barely above the wave tops, stayed there for 5 seconds, descended again. In that brief moment, the fire control solution was updated, the target confirmed, the decision made. Then, torpedoes in the water, explosions in the distance, another ship sinking, another ton of cargo lost, another increment of pressure on an empire that was slowly suffocating. The war would end not with dramatic battles, but with this slow strangulation, ship by ship, convoy by convoy, until there was nothing left to strangle. And at the heart of that campaign was a simple innovation, the periscope that barely touched the surface, the glimpse that was enough, the technique that made invisibility possible. It was not the weapon that won the war, but it was the method that allowed the weapon to be used effectively. And sometimes, that is all that history requires. Not perfect solutions, but effective ones, deployed by people willing to question assumptions and organizations flexible enough to learn.